The moment people begin calling someone invisible is often the moment they reveal the emptiness inside themselves, and before the evening ended, one man's decision would force an entire room to question everything they believed about power and respect. The DeLuca estate stood proudly above the rolling hills outside Boston, its limestone walls glowing beneath hundreds of carefully placed lights as luxury vehicles arrived one after another along the circular driveway. Inside the magnificent mansion, crystal chandeliers cast warm reflections across polished marble floors, while a live string quartet filled the grand ballroom with elegant music. Business leaders, politicians, philanthropists, and influential entrepreneurs exchanged confident smiles as they gathered for Adrian DeLuca's annual private charity dinner, an invitation reserved for only the city's most respected names. Every detail reflected excellence, from the handcrafted floral arrangements to the perfectly arranged dining tables covered in white linen and polished silver. Moving quietly among the guests was Maya Brooks, a 29-year-old Black Maid whose neatly pressed black and white uniform stood in sharp contrast to the designer gowns and tailored tuxedos surrounding her. She greeted every guest with the same gentle smile, carefully refilled crystal glasses before anyone had to ask, and quietly adjusted chairs whenever she noticed someone uncomfortable. Long hours and years of honest work had taught her to carry herself with quiet confidence rather than loud pride. She believed that dignity was not something another person could give or take away. It was something chosen every morning before the day even began. Near the center of the ballroom, a group of wealthy guests laughed while discussing luxury vacations and exclusive clubs. As Maya approached carrying a polished silver tray of sparkling water, an elegantly dressed businesswoman glanced toward her before turning back to the group with an amused smile. "Look," she said loudly enough for nearby conversations to pause. "She is standing there like she actually belongs in a room like this." A few guests chuckled politely. Another man lifted his glass and smiled. "She is just a servant. People like her should remember where they fit." More laughter spread through the crowd. Someone quietly added, "At least she is dressed appropriately for carrying trays." The comments floated through the ballroom beneath the beautiful music, creating a strange contrast between elegance and cruelty. Maya heard every word. For a brief moment she paused, then continued exactly as she had before, offering sparkling water with calm professionalism and thanking each guest who accepted a glass. She did not defend herself. She did not argue. She simply continued treating every person with the same kindness they had refused to show her. A younger server standing nearby lowered his eyes, embarrassed by what he had witnessed, but Maya gave him a reassuring smile, as if reminding him that one person's bitterness should never become another person's burden. At the opposite end of the ballroom, Adrian DeLuca stood speaking with several distinguished guests about charitable initiatives and future investments. Although his expression remained calm, his attention quietly shifted toward the laughter echoing across the room. He watched Maya continue serving with remarkable composure while the guests around her seemed increasingly comfortable making jokes at her expense. Beside him stood his longtime chief of staff, Daniel Mercer, who noticed the subtle change in Adrian's expression. "Everything all right?" Daniel asked softly. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched Maya help an elderly guest adjust his chair before offering the man a warm smile that received sincere gratitude in return. Then Adrian slowly turned his attention back toward the group responsible for the mockery, carefully studying each face as though committing every expression to memory. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "people reveal who they really are when they believe kindness has no value." Daniel followed his gaze without speaking again. Around them, the celebration continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Glasses clinked together, laughter returned, and conversations about success filled the magnificent ballroom once more. Yet standing silently among the city's most powerful people, Adrian realized the evening was no longer about business, charity, or prestige. Without anyone recognizing it, the grand celebration had quietly become a test of character, and before the night reached its end, every person inside the DeLuca estate would discover that the greatest measure of power had nothing to do with wealth at all. Ignoring the cruel remarks required more strength than answering them ever would have, and Maya Brooks had spent enough years carrying responsibilities that silence no longer felt like weakness. She continued moving gracefully through the ballroom, balancing polished silver trays beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, while conversations flowed around her as though nothing unpleasant had occurred. Every guest received the same respectful greeting regardless of whether they had smiled at her or laughed moments earlier. She quietly refilled sparkling water, adjusted elegant place settings, and thanked each person who accepted her service. The younger employees watched her with quiet admiration because they knew how difficult it was to remain gracious when others questioned your worth. Near the entrance to the dining hall, a nervous young server accidentally dropped a folded linen napkin onto the polished marble floor just as the first dinner course was about to begin. His face immediately filled with panic, afraid the mistake would be noticed by the guests. Before anyone else reacted, Maya calmly picked up a fresh napkin from the nearby service station, handed it to him with an encouraging smile, and softly said, "Take a deep breath. One small mistake never defines a good worker." The young man nodded gratefully, his hands no longer trembling as he returned to his duties. A few steps later, Maya noticed one of the elderly guests struggling to reach the chair that had been placed slightly too far from the table. Without interrupting the surrounding conversation, she quietly adjusted the chair, helped him settle comfortably, and made certain his water glass remained within easy reach. "Thank you, young lady," he said warmly. Maya smiled. "It is my pleasure, sir. I hope you enjoy your evening." Across the ballroom, Adrian DeLuca observed each small interaction while continuing conversations with business leaders and charitable sponsors. The discussions around him centered on investment opportunities, fundraising goals, and future partnerships, yet his attention repeatedly returned to Maya. He noticed that every employee she encouraged became more confident. Every guest she assisted became more comfortable. Her kindness required no audience, no applause, and no recognition. Daniel Mercer quietly followed Adrian's gaze before speaking in a low voice. "She has a remarkable way of making difficult moments disappear." Adrian nodded slightly. "That is a rare gift. Most people only notice themselves." Meanwhile, the same group of wealthy guests gathered near the grand staircase continued entertaining one another. The elegant businesswoman who had mocked Maya earlier watched as Maya patiently helped another employee steady a serving cart before turning back toward her companions with a faint smile. "She certainly acts as though she owns the place," she remarked. A man wearing an expensive tailored suit laughed softly. "Perhaps she believes hard work can buy a seat at our table." Another guest casually replied, "People like her should remember that service is respectable only when it stays invisible." This time the laughter spread farther across the ballroom. Several nearby guests smiled awkwardly, uncertain whether to join in or remain silent. Maya heard every word while placing fresh bread onto polished dinner plates. She neither hurried nor hesitated. She simply completed her work with the same steady professionalism that had defined every moment of the evening. The contrast between her quiet dignity and their effortless arrogance became increasingly difficult to ignore. Even a few guests who had laughed earlier now lowered their eyes as she thanked them with genuine kindness before moving on to the next table. Adrian noticed the subtle shift in the room immediately. Some people were beginning to feel uncomfortable, not because anyone had challenged them, but because Maya had refused to become the person they expected. Daniel glanced toward the laughing group once more before asking, "Should someone put an end to this?" Adrian remained silent for several long seconds. His calm expression revealed nothing, yet his eyes never left the people who continued exposing their character one careless sentence at a time. Finally, he answered in a quiet voice, "Not yet. Some lessons are only understood after people reveal exactly who they are." Around them, the musicians transitioned into a slower melody as the dining room doors opened for the formal dinner. Guests believed the evening was finally beginning, completely unaware that the most important decision of the night had not yet been made. The first dinner course arrived with flawless precision as uniformed staff moved gracefully through the magnificent ballroom, carrying polished silver trays beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Crystal glasses reflected golden light, while elegant conversations drifted from one end of the room to the other. To many of the distinguished guests, the evening appeared perfect. They admired the luxurious surroundings, praised the impeccable service, and congratulated Adrian DeLuca on another extraordinary gathering. Yet Adrian barely noticed the compliments. Instead, he quietly observed something far more revealing than expensive suits or generous donations. He watched the way people treated those they believed could never influence their future. Maya Brooks continued serving each table with remarkable calm, never allowing the unkind remarks from earlier to alter her expression. As she passed through the ballroom, she noticed one of the musicians searching anxiously beneath his chair beside the small stage. Without hesitation, she gently placed her serving tray on a nearby table and knelt beside him. After only a few moments, she discovered a small silver cuff link that had rolled beneath the curtain. The relieved musician smiled with gratitude. "I thought I would spend the rest of the evening searching for that." Maya handed it back with a warm smile. "I am glad it found its owner again." Before anyone nearby could even acknowledge what had happened, she quietly returned to her duties. Adrian witnessed the entire exchange. From across the room, he noticed that Maya never waited for appreciation. Helping others simply seemed as natural to her as breathing. Daniel Mercer leaned slightly toward him. "She does not seem to know how to walk past someone who needs help." Adrian answered softly, "Some people build influence. Others quietly build trust. The second is much harder to find." Near the center of the ballroom, the elegant businesswoman who had started the evening's mockery noticed Maya assisting another employee with arranging dessert plates before smiling toward the guests around her. "She certainly enjoys pretending she is indispensable," she remarked. A businessman laughed. "Every event needs people to carry trays. It does not make them important." Another guest casually added, "Service is admirable, provided servants remember they are not the reason anyone came tonight." This time several guests laughed more confidently, believing the earlier remarks had passed without consequence. Maya heard every sentence while carefully placing fresh butter beside each dinner plate. She simply thanked each guest with the same calm courtesy before continuing to the next table. Across from the laughing group, an elderly woman quietly watched the exchange. When Maya approached to refill her water glass, she gently touched Maya's hand. "Thank you for your kindness this evening," she whispered sincerely. Maya smiled. "You are very welcome, ma'am." The elderly woman continued watching her walk away before turning thoughtfully toward the guests who had been laughing only moments before. Their expensive jewelry suddenly seemed far less impressive than the quiet dignity they had failed to notice standing only a few feet away. Adrian observed that moment as well. He realized something important was happening beneath the surface of the evening. Without speaking a single word, Maya was slowly dividing the room into two groups. There were those who judged people by status, and those beginning to recognize character. Neither group fully understood that Adrian had been watching every interaction since the first careless joke echoed through the ballroom. One by one, he silently remembered every face, every smile, every unnecessary remark, allowing each person the freedom to reveal exactly who they were. Daniel finally looked toward him once more. "You already know what you are going to do not you?" Adrian remained silent for several seconds before calmly lifting his glass. His expression revealed neither anger nor disappointment, only quiet certainty. "Not yet," he replied. "They have not finished showing me who deserves my respect." As the musicians began another elegant melody and guests prepared for the next course, the ballroom remained filled with laughter, polished silver, and effortless luxury. None of the distinguished visitors realized they were no longer attending a charity dinner alone. Without invitation or warning, every one of them had become part of a far more important examination, and before the evening reached its final course, the person they had dismissed as invisible would become the reason none of them would ever remember the night the same way again. The second dinner course had barely begun when the atmosphere inside the DeLuca estate shifted in a way no one could have predicted. Soft violin music continued floating through the ballroom, while servers moved gracefully between elegantly decorated tables, yet beneath the polished surface a growing tension lingered in the air. Maya Brooks quietly carried a silver tray filled with fresh coffee and warm desserts, stopping at each table with the same calm professionalism she had shown since the evening began. She thanked every guest with genuine courtesy, even those who had mocked her only minutes before. To Maya, kindness was never something reserved for people who earned it. It was a promise she had made to herself long ago. As she approached the table where the elegant businesswoman and several influential investors were seated, the woman slowly looked up from her conversation with a smile that carried neither warmth nor respect. She accepted a cup of coffee before glancing toward Maya's uniform. "You have certainly been busy tonight," she said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Maya answered politely, "I hope everything has met your expectations, ma'am." The woman smiled faintly. "Actually, I believe there is one thing that would improve the evening." Maya waited quietly. The woman rested her cup onto the saucer before speaking with effortless confidence. "I think the dining room should be reserved for guests. The staff should remain where they belong. It is distracting having servants constantly standing nearby while important conversations are taking place." Several people around the table exchanged uncertain glances. One businessman nodded in agreement. "She has a point. Formal occasions usually separate guests from household employees." Another quietly added, "It simply maintains the proper atmosphere." Maya lowered her eyes respectfully. "If my presence is causing discomfort, I can continue serving from the side entrance." Before she could step away, the woman spoke again. "No, I think it would be better if you left the ballroom altogether until dinner is finished." The words settled heavily across the room. Nearby conversations gradually faded as more guests realized what had just been said. The younger servers froze where they stood. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, the longtime housekeeper, looked toward Maya with obvious concern but remained silent, understanding that challenging an influential guest herself would only create greater embarrassment. Maya took a slow breath. She felt every pair of eyes turning toward her, yet her voice remained calm. "If that is the host's instruction, I will gladly follow it." She turned slightly, preparing to leave without argument. At the opposite end of the ballroom, Adrian DeLuca had heard every word. Daniel Mercer quietly watched him, already recognizing the familiar stillness that appeared whenever Adrian reached an important decision. Adrian remained seated for several long moments, his expression impossible to read. He slowly placed his fork beside his untouched dinner, folded his linen napkin with deliberate care, and looked across the ballroom toward Maya, who had nearly reached the doorway. Then he turned his attention toward the table where the request had been made. The elegant businesswoman smiled confidently, believing the uncomfortable moment had already passed and that the evening would continue as before. She had no idea that her final remark had crossed a line Adrian had silently refused to ignore. Throughout the ballroom, every conversation stopped completely. Crystal glasses remained untouched. Musicians lowered their instruments, and dozens of distinguished guests instinctively shifted their attention toward the head of the room. Adrian calmly pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. No dramatic gesture accompanied the movement. No anger appeared on his face. Yet the quiet sound of the chair sliding across polished marble seemed louder than every conversation that had filled the ballroom only moments before, and every person present suddenly understood that the evening they thought they controlled was about to change forever. Adrian DeLuca stood in complete silence for several long seconds, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over the ballroom without raising his voice or demanding anyone's attention. The musicians quietly lowered their instruments. Conversations disappeared entirely, and even the gentle clinking of crystal glasses came to an end. Every guest instinctively turned toward him. Maya Brooks had nearly reached the dining room doorway when she noticed the unusual silence behind her. She slowly stopped and looked back, uncertain whether someone had called her name. Adrian stepped away from the head table with calm, deliberate confidence. His polished shoes echoed softly across the marble floor as he walked toward the center of the ballroom. No one dared interrupt him. When he finally stopped, he looked first toward Maya, then toward the elegantly dressed businesswoman whose request had filled the room only moments before. His expression remained composed. "Miss Brooks," he said gently, "please remain exactly where you are." Maya nodded respectfully without speaking. Adrian then turned toward the guests. "I have listened carefully throughout this evening," he began. "I have heard discussions about leadership, generosity, responsibility, and the importance of serving our communities." Several guests shifted uneasily in their seats. Adrian continued in the same calm tone. "Yet the greatest lesson tonight has not come from any speech delivered at this dinner. It has come from the way some people chose to treat someone they believed had no influence over their lives." The elegant businesswoman attempted a polite smile. "Adrian, I believe this has become a misunderstanding. My intention was simply to preserve the atmosphere of a formal gathering." Adrian met her eyes without anger. "A formal gathering should elevate our character, not lower it." The ballroom remained completely silent. Before anyone could respond, another distinguished guest, Richard Caldwell, one of Adrian's most important business partners, slowly stood from his chair. Richard was widely respected throughout the financial community, and everyone present knew the two men had spent months negotiating a partnership expected to benefit both organizations. Richard adjusted his jacket before speaking carefully. "Adrian, surely we can resolve this privately. There is no need to embarrass valued guests over an emotional misunderstanding." Adrian listened respectfully. Richard continued, "We have an agreement waiting to be finalized tomorrow morning. I would hate to see unnecessary conflict affect years of professional cooperation." The meaning behind his words was immediately understood throughout the ballroom. Several guests quietly exchanged glances. The message was unmistakable. If Adrian continued defending Maya publicly, the partnership might disappear. Daniel Mercer recognized the growing tension and silently watched Adrian's expression, knowing this decision could influence far more than a single evening. Maya also understood what was happening. She took one careful step forward and spoke for the first time. "Mr. DeLuca, please do not allow this situation to create difficulties for you. I can leave. I never wanted to become the reason anyone loses an opportunity." Adrian turned toward her. His expression softened slightly. "Miss Brooks, do you believe you have done something wrong tonight?" Maya answered honestly. "No, sir." Adrian nodded once. "Neither do I." He then faced Richard again. "You believe protecting another person's dignity creates unnecessary conflict. I believe remaining silent while someone is humiliated creates something far worse." Richard's smile slowly disappeared. "You are willing to risk a partnership of this size over a servant?" Adrian did not hesitate. His answer came quietly, but every word carried unmistakable conviction. "No partnership that requires me to ignore another person's humanity is worth accepting." A wave of astonishment moved through the ballroom. Several guests looked at Richard. Others looked toward Maya, whose eyes reflected quiet disbelief. No contracts had been signed. No voices had been raised. Yet in that single moment, everyone present realized Adrian had calmly placed principle above profit, and the evening had crossed a point from which it could never return. Ignoring the stunned silence surrounding him, Adrian DeLuca calmly stepped away from the center of the ballroom and walked toward Maya Brooks, whose hand still rested quietly around the polished silver tray she had been carrying when the evening changed forever. Every eye in the room followed his movement. Richard Caldwell remained standing beside the table, his expression controlled but unmistakably disappointed, while the elegant businesswoman who had demanded Maya leave the ballroom now seemed uncertain whether to speak again. Maya looked at Adrian with quiet concern. "Sir," she said softly, "please do not let this become more difficult because of me." Adrian stopped only a few feet away and offered her a calm smile. "Miss Brooks, this evening stopped being about you a long time ago. It became about the kind of people we choose to become when kindness costs us something." The words settled gently across the ballroom. Adrian turned toward the nearest server and spoke with the same composed authority that had earned the respect of everyone who worked inside the DeLuca estate. "Please bring another place setting." The young server hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yes, sir." Several guests exchanged bewildered glances as the server hurried toward the dining room. Richard quietly stepped forward once more. "Adrian, think carefully. There is still time to put this misunderstanding behind us." Adrian met his longtime associate's eyes with genuine respect. "I have thought carefully." Richard lowered his voice. "You are risking a partnership that will benefit hundreds of employees and families." Adrian answered without raising his own voice. "A partnership that depends upon overlooking someone else's dignity begins with the wrong foundation." The room remained silent. Even those who privately agreed with Richard found themselves unable to challenge Adrian's calm conviction. Moments later, the server returned carrying a complete place setting. Adrian personally accepted the polished silverware and fine china before walking toward the long banquet table. Without ceremony, he placed the setting directly beside his own seat. Then he turned toward Maya once again. "Please join us." Maya looked around the ballroom, visibly overwhelmed by the attention. "Sir, I am a member of the household staff." Adrian nodded. "You are. And tonight you have also been the person who treated every guest with more respect than many guests showed each other." Maya struggled to find words. "I never expected." Adrian gently interrupted with a reassuring smile. That is exactly why this matters. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes quietly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye, while several younger employees watched with unmistakable pride. The elderly gentleman whom Maya had assisted earlier slowly rose from his chair and offered an encouraging nod. Please accept his invitation, he said warmly. You have earned it many times over. Maya took a slow breath before carefully setting the silver tray onto a nearby service table. Each step toward the banquet table felt almost unreal. She had entered the ballroom that evening expecting nothing more than another long shift, never imagining she would become the center of a lesson about respect. Adrian stepped aside and gently pulled back the chair waiting beside him. After you, he said simply. Maya slowly took her seat, her posture remaining humble despite the extraordinary moment unfolding around her. No applause broke the silence. None was needed. The image of the Black Maid seated beside the host at the head of the table spoke more powerfully than any speech ever could. Richard Caldwell quietly looked away, understanding that Adrian's decision could no longer be reversed. The elegant businesswoman lowered her eyes toward her untouched dinner, no longer finding confidence in the opinions she had expressed earlier. Throughout the magnificent ballroom, people who had arrived believing status determined value now faced a far more difficult truth. The most honorable place in the room had not been given to the wealthiest guest or the most influential investor. It had been offered to the one person whose character had remained unshaken when every reason existed to surrender it. And in the deep silence that followed, no one questioned Adrian's choice because every heart in the room already knew it was the right one. For several quiet moments, no one in the ballroom moved. Maya Brooks sat beside Adrian DeLuca with the same humility she had carried throughout the evening, her hands resting gently beside the place setting that had been prepared for her. The magnificent banquet table looked exactly as it had before, covered with polished silver, crystal glasses, and elegant floral arrangements. Yet the atmosphere had been transformed completely. The silence no longer carried tension alone. It carried reflection. Adrian calmly unfolded his linen napkin and looked toward the nearest server. Please make certain Miss Brooks receives the same dinner every guest has enjoyed tonight. The young server smiled proudly before returning to the kitchen. Maya looked toward Adrian with quiet gratitude. Thank you, sir, but I never expected anything like this. Adrian answered gently. Respect should never depend on expectation. His words settled softly throughout the room. After a few moments, he turned toward the gathered guests. This evening, many conversations centered on leadership, he began. Some spoke about influence. Others spoke about responsibility. I listened carefully. No one interrupted. Richard Caldwell remained standing in thoughtful silence, while the elegant businesswoman lowered her eyes toward the table. Adrian continued in the same calm voice. Leadership is not measured by the number of people willing to follow us. It is measured by whether we are willing to stand beside someone when doing so comes with a personal cost. Every guest understood the meaning behind the statement. Adrian slowly looked around the ballroom, meeting one face after another. Throughout this evening, I watched Miss Brooks help employees without being asked. I watched her assist elderly guests with genuine kindness. I watched her remain respectful after hearing words that no person deserves to hear. Not once did she answer disrespect with bitterness. He paused briefly before continuing. Character is revealed most clearly when someone has every reason to lose it and chooses not to. Across the ballroom, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes quietly nodded through grateful tears, while several younger staff members exchanged proud smiles. The elderly gentleman who had thanked Maya earlier slowly lifted his glass toward her before placing it back onto the table without speaking. Richard finally broke the silence. Adrian, perhaps we all judged too quickly. Adrian answered respectfully. Perhaps. The important question is whether we are willing to correct ourselves once we recognize the mistake. The elegant businesswoman took a slow breath, clearly struggling with the weight of the evening. She looked toward Maya for the first time without arrogance. Maya noticed but said nothing. She had never wanted anyone to feel humiliated. She had only wanted the opportunity to complete her work with dignity. The server returned carrying a warm dinner prepared especially for Maya. As the plate was placed before her, Adrian smiled slightly. Please enjoy your meal while it is still warm. Maya hesitated before quietly picking up her fork. I appreciate your kindness. Adrian shook his head gently. Kindness is not something to appreciate only when it is offered to you. It should be offered to everyone. Those simple words lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. Around the magnificent ballroom, several guests quietly reflected upon conversations they had once considered harmless. The laughter from earlier now seemed strangely distant, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that the evening had exposed something far more valuable than success or influence. Maya slowly began eating while the room remained respectfully quiet, no longer because anyone expected silence, but because every person present instinctively understood they were witnessing something far more meaningful than another formal dinner. In that peaceful moment, the expensive suits, sparkling jewelry, and prestigious titles surrounding the banquet table faded into the background, leaving only one unforgettable truth standing at the center of the evening. Real power had never belonged to the loudest voice or the richest guest. It belonged to the person willing to protect another human being's dignity when everyone else found it easier to look away. Maya Brooks held the fork gently in her hand, but her attention remained fixed on the people surrounding the magnificent banquet table rather than the elegant dinner before her. She had never imagined becoming the center of a room filled with influential guests, and despite Adrian DeLuca's quiet reassurance, she still carried herself with the same humility that had guided every ordinary day of her life. Around the ballroom, conversations slowly returned, although every voice seemed noticeably softer than before. The laughter that had echoed through the room earlier had disappeared completely. Adrian looked across the gathered guests with calm composure before speaking again. "Tonight has reminded me of something my father once taught me," he said quietly. He believed the easiest way to understand a person's character was not by watching how they treated someone powerful. It was by watching how they treated the person who could never repay them. The room became silent once more. Adrian turned toward Richard Caldwell. "May I ask you a simple question?" Richard nodded respectfully. "Of course." Adrian rested one hand upon the table. If Miss Brooks had arrived tonight wearing an expensive evening gown instead of a housekeeping uniform, would anyone have spoken to her the same way? Richard hesitated. He glanced briefly toward the elegant businesswoman before lowering his eyes. "Probably not." Adrian slowly nodded. "Then the problem was never her behavior. It was our assumptions." No one disagreed. Adrian then looked toward the elegant businesswoman, his voice remaining calm and respectful. "Earlier this evening you believed Miss Brooks should leave the ballroom because she was a servant. May I ask what she did that deserved such treatment?" The woman struggled to answer. She looked toward Maya, then back toward Adrian. "She did nothing wrong," she admitted quietly. "I simply believed." Her words faded before she finished the sentence. Adrian waited patiently. Finally she sighed. "I judged her because of the work she does." Adrian gave a slight nod. "Thank you for your honesty." Maya quietly listened without resentment, her expression unchanged. She had never hoped to embarrass anyone. She only hoped the evening would end with greater understanding than it had begun. At that moment, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes stepped forward from the staff entrance after Adrian offered her a small, encouraging glance. She folded her hands respectfully before addressing the guests. "Many of you met Miss Brooks for the first time tonight," she said. "I have worked beside her for 4 years." Every eye turned toward the longtime housekeeper. Mrs. Hayes smiled warmly. "Whenever someone on our staff becomes ill, she volunteers to cover their shift without complaint. Last winter, she quietly organized warm clothing for 2 employees whose homes lost heat during a snowstorm. She never asked for recognition. In fact, most of us only discovered what she had done after everything was already finished." A quiet murmur spread throughout the ballroom. Mrs. Hayes continued. "When my husband was recovering from surgery, Miss Brooks visited him every weekend with homemade meals because she knew I rarely had time to cook after work. She never told anyone. She simply believed neighbors should help one another." Maya looked visibly uncomfortable as attention returned to her. "Mrs. Hayes, please," she said softly. "Anyone would have done the same." Mrs. Hayes smiled gently. "That is exactly what makes you different. Many people say that. You actually do it." Adrian watched the reactions spreading across the room. Faces that had once reflected confidence now carried quiet reflection instead. The elegant businesswoman slowly removed the jeweled bracelet from her wrist and turned it thoughtfully between her fingers, no longer certain that wealth had ever been the most valuable thing she possessed. Richard Caldwell quietly looked toward Maya with newfound respect. Throughout the ballroom, people who had arrived believing success was measured by titles and influence were beginning to recognize a far greater measure of greatness. Without seeking attention, without defending herself, and without speaking more than necessary, Maya Brooks had accomplished something no speech delivered that evening had managed to achieve. She had quietly reminded an entire room that genuine character is never revealed by the clothes a person wears, but by the kindness they continue choosing even when the world gives them every reason to stop. Maya Brooks lowered her eyes as the quiet praise continued spreading across the ballroom, wishing the attention would move away from her as gently as it had arrived. She had never believed ordinary acts of kindness deserved applause. To her, they were simply the natural responsibilities of being a decent human being. She looked toward Adrian DeLuca and spoke softly enough that only the nearest guests needed to lean forward to hear her. "Sir, I appreciate everything you have done tonight, but I hope no one leaves believing I am extraordinary. I only tried to do what I hoped someone would do for my own family." Adrian regarded her with quiet admiration before asking, "And what would that be?" Maya smiled gently. "To remember that every person carries a story you cannot see." The words settled over the ballroom with remarkable calm. She continued after a thoughtful pause. "When people see my uniform, they imagine they already know my life. They do not see the mornings I spend helping my mother before work. They do not see the evenings I use to deliver groceries to an elderly neighbor who can no longer drive. They do not see the dreams I placed aside so someone else in my family could keep theirs alive. None of that makes me special. It simply makes me human." The room remained perfectly still. Richard Caldwell slowly returned to his seat. Without speaking, the elegant businesswoman who had demanded Maya leave the ballroom quietly looked toward her folded hands, unable to meet Maya's eyes for several long moments. Adrian rested both hands lightly upon the table before speaking again. "That is precisely why this evening matters," he said. "We often believe we understand people after learning their occupation. In reality, we usually understand almost nothing." An elderly gentleman near the far end of the table nodded thoughtfully. "We spend years teaching children not to judge others," he said quietly. "Somewhere along the way, many adults forget the lesson." Several guests exchanged reflective glances. One woman removed the event program from beside her dinner plate and slowly folded it without realizing she was doing so, her attention completely fixed upon the conversation unfolding before her. Maya finally lifted her fork again, taking another small bite of dinner before setting it back onto the plate. Even now, she seemed more comfortable serving others than sitting among them. Adrian noticed immediately. "You are still worried about the staff finishing their work, are not you?" Maya smiled apologetically. "I know how much remains to be done after a dinner like this." Adrian looked toward Daniel Mercer, who immediately understood. Daniel smiled reassuringly. "Everything is under control. Every employee insisted they wanted you to remain exactly where you are." A faint expression of surprise crossed Maya's face. Several staff members standing quietly near the service entrance nodded with warm smiles of encouragement. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes folded her hands proudly, her eyes reflecting years of admiration that words alone could never fully express. Adrian slowly rose from his chair once again, though this time there was no tension in his movement. He lifted his crystal glass only slightly before speaking to the entire room. "Tonight, I believed I was hosting a charity dinner," he said. "Instead, I received a lesson about compassion from someone who never asked to teach one." His eyes briefly met Maya's before returning to the guests. "Money can improve lives. Influence can open doors. Success can create opportunities. None of those things automatically make us honorable. Honor begins with how we treat people who have nothing to offer except their humanity." No one applauded. The silence that followed carried far greater meaning than applause ever could. One by one, guests who had arrived expecting to celebrate wealth and achievement quietly realized they had witnessed something far more valuable. Without seeking recognition, without defending herself, and without asking anyone to change, Maya Brooks had transformed the evening simply by refusing to surrender her kindness. In the warm glow of the chandeliers, surrounded by polished silver and elegant crystal, the most memorable person in the DeLuca estate was no longer the wealthiest guest or the most influential investor. It was the woman whose quiet dignity had reminded everyone that the strongest heart in any room is often the one the world notices last. The warmth that settled over the DeLuca estate that evening could not be measured by the glow of its chandeliers or the elegance of its grand ballroom. It came from something far less visible and far more enduring. Guests who had arrived expecting an evening devoted to prestige and influence now found themselves quietly reflecting upon the choices they had made only hours earlier. Maya Brooks remained seated beside Adrienne DeLuca with the same modest grace that had defined her throughout the night. She had never asked for recognition, and even now she seemed more concerned that everyone else felt comfortable than she did about the attention surrounding her. Richard Caldwell slowly stood once more. This time there was no confidence in his posture, only quiet honesty. He looked toward Adrienne before turning to Maya. "Miss Brooks," he began, "I have spent most of my career believing success meant surrounding myself with impressive people. Tonight, I realized I overlooked the most impressive person in the room because I only noticed a uniform. I regret that." Maya looked at him with the same gentle expression she had offered every guest throughout the evening. "Thank you," she replied softly. Recognizing a mistake is never easy. Richard nodded gratefully before extending his hand toward Adrienne. "As for our partnership, if protecting another person's dignity is the principle upon which you lead your organization, then perhaps I understand your leadership better tonight than I did during months of negotiations." Adrienne accepted the handshake with quiet respect. "Then this evening has been worthwhile." A gentle wave of relief passed through the ballroom. The elegant businesswoman slowly rose from her chair as well. Earlier she had spoken with certainty, believing status determined worth. Now her voice carried unmistakable humility. "Miss Brooks," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I judged your profession instead of your character. I believed refinement came from wealth when it actually comes from kindness. I hope one day you will forgive my arrogance." Maya stood slowly, meeting the woman's eyes without bitterness. Holding on to resentment would only make my own heart heavier. "I forgive you." The simple answer carried more power than any accusation ever could. Around the ballroom, several guests quietly lowered their heads, recognizing that forgiveness required greater strength than pride. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes smiled warmly while the younger staff members exchanged relieved glances, witnessing a moment they would remember long after the evening ended. Adrienne looked around the magnificent room one final time before lifting his crystal glass. Every conversation faded naturally. "Tonight began as a charity dinner," he said calmly. "I believed we would spend the evening discussing how to improve our communities. Instead, we were reminded that every meaningful change begins much closer to home. It begins with the way we choose to treat the person standing directly in front of us." One by one, guests slowly lifted their own glasses. No one needed encouragement. No one hesitated. Adrienne looked toward Maya with quiet admiration before speaking the final words. "To dignity that cannot be purchased, to kindness that asks for nothing in return, and to the courage of those who choose compassion even when the world mistakes it for weakness." Crystal glasses rose throughout the ballroom. "To Miss Brooks," voices answered together. Maya looked around the room, her eyes quietly glistening beneath the warm golden light. She had entered the DeLuca estate that morning as a member of the household staff, expecting nothing more than another ordinary day of honest work. She would leave exactly the same woman she had always been. The difference was not within her. It was within everyone else who had finally learned to see her clearly. As the music gently resumed and conversations slowly returned with a new sense of humility, Adrienne watched the room with peaceful satisfaction. He had not protected Maya because she was extraordinary. He had protected her because every human being deserves someone willing to stand beside them when dignity is placed at risk. And as the final moments of the evening settled quietly over the DeLuca estate, every guest understood that true power is never proven by how many people stand behind you. It is revealed by whether you are willing to stand beside the one person everyone else has chosen to overlook.